the September 28th, 2020 meeting of the Planning Commission Working Group. Ms. Cook, would you please call the roll?
Certainly. Mr. O'Connor?
Here.
Mr. O'Connor is an at-large member. Ms. Leverins?
She had to step away for just a minute.
I'm sorry, yes. She's present, but away for the moment.
Yes.
Mr. Haldeman?
Here.
Mr. Haldeman represents the Berkeley District. Mr. Polster?
Here.
Mr. Polster represents the Jamestown District. Dr. Rose? Dr. Rose will be joining the meeting later. Dr. Rose represents the Roberts District. Ms. Null? Ms. Null is currently not in attendance. She represents the Stonehouse District. Mr. Kropp?
Present.
Mr. Kropp represents the Powhatan District and is chair of the PC. Ms. Wortman?
Here.
Ms. Wortman represents the community participation team, and we have a quorum.
Thank you, Ms. Cook. Just a reminder that to use the raise your hand icon during the course of the meeting, just so nobody gets talked over. Ms. Cook will now introduce the staff and the consultant team.
Yes, thank you. I am Ellen Cook, Principal Planner, and joining me today from James City County are Paul Holt, Tammy Rosario, Thomas Wysong, Tori Haynes, and Tom Leininger and John Reisinger. Also joining us are our partners in this comprehensive plan update, our consultants Vlad Garilovic and Todd Gordon from EPRPC, and Leanne King from Clarion Associates. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Everyone saw what's now become, unfortunately, a standard component of our packages, and that's the resolution to conduct this meeting virtually. I'll summarize it and then look for a motion. But on September the 8th, 2020, the board readopted the continuity of government ordinance, which under certain circumstances permits this committee to conduct today's meeting via electronic or telephonic means without a quorum of members physically present. May I have a motion for adoption of that resolution that's in your packets for this afternoon's meeting?
Haldeman moves.
Thank you. Do we need to do a roll call, Ellen, or can we do a voice vote on this one?
I think it'd be permissible either way at the preference of the working group.
Okay. All those in favor of the motion?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed?
Aye.
Oh, okay. Although these meetings have not typically had a public comment period, we do allow the public to submit comments through mail, telephonic means, or email, and make their comments. Ms. Cook, have there been any public comments submitted for this?
No, there were none received for this meeting.
Okay, thank you. I'll now turn it over to the planning team for the preliminary preferred scenario information presentation. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. John, thank you. All right, well, again, thank you to the working group. If you could go to the next slide, John. Our agenda today includes 4 main items, with the bulk of the time for items 2 and 3 on this slide, the preferred scenario framework and the plan policy framework, hopefully allowing plenty of time for the working group questions and discussion. Next slide. The preferred scenario framework and policy framework will be discussed again on the 5th and potentially the 19th as we prepare for a discussion with the board on the 27th. Staff will also be presenting additional chapter technical reports for initial review. Meanwhile, the CPT will continue its efforts to review and summarize public input from the engagement activities from round 2 to share with the Planning Commission Working Group and Board for the 19th and 27th. Next slide. The preferred scenario framework and policy framework will inform the refined goals and policies framework, the drafting of the new land use map, and ultimately the creation of the preferred scenario leave-behind models and incorporation of information into the chapter text. And with that, I will now turn the presentation over to Vlad for the next slide.
Thank you, Alan. Well, good evening, everyone. Vlad Gavrilovic, Principal of EPR. Pleased to present to you tonight the Preferred Scenario Framework. This is a summary of the 50-plus page white paper that was in your packet. And there's a lot of detail and material there. But what we're going to do is kind of present a high-level summary of that and try to go through it and leave plenty of time for any questions and discussions you have. As Alan mentioned, you have 3 meetings, basically this meeting, October 5th and October 19th, before your joint meeting with the Board of Supervisors to discuss both the Preferred Scenario Framework and implications for policy development, preliminary considerations for new policies. After I present the Preferred Scenario Framework, Leanne is going to touch on how the process for developing new policies based on what we've heard from the Preferred Scenario Framework, from the input from the public, the goals questionnaire, the alternatives questionnaire, and how to shape all that into the development of a refined policy framework for the new comprehensive plan. So let me get into the next slide, into the kind of structure of that white paper. There were 3 main parts to this. One was the preferred scenario policy themes, and that is based on the 5 public input themes that we've been using all along: the nature and environment, community character, affordable housing, economic development, and quality of life. And for each one of those themes, there's a kind of what we've heard slide, which is the public input and the results of the scenario testing. And then there's a slide on potential implications for policy development. The second main part is a map, a conceptual framework map for what this preferred scenario could look like. And then the third part is additional planning concepts, some additional food for thought for both development of new policies and implementation of those to start to realize the vision that's applied in this preferred scenario framework. And then the final part is appendices that talks about the scenario planning process, how the scenarios were built, and the results. Next slide. So I'm going to get into the first part of this, which is the policy themes. And as I mentioned, there's 2 slides for each policy theme. The first talks about kind of what we heard and what we found. And the next slide talks about the implications for future policies. So the first thing is the blue box on the right has the relative preference for one scenario over the other. In each of the questions, the preferences that the public said in their alternative questionnaire was for scenario B over scenario A. It received more votes or stars for all the questions. But what this shows is kind of a percent margin of preference. So how much was scenario B preferred over scenario A, gotten by weighting the responses by number of stars. So I think this received the highest preference, nature and environment, 192% margin of preference for the images slides and 198% margin for the numbers slides. In addition, what we heard, and the results here on what we heard include the 2019 citizen survey conducted in the fall, which, as you recall, was a statistically valid survey, phone survey that got over 1,000 responses from citizens in the county. It also includes material from 2019 summit that we held in November, which was also polling of respondents online and in person. And then it includes results of the computer modeling, the scenario testing. So some of the things we heard on this, for example, was there was a 15% satisfaction gap in protecting the environment. And what that means is the difference between how important this was to people versus how satisfied they were with how well the county was protecting the environment or addressing this issue. 86% of people in this 2019 summit thought that it was very important to do more to improve our efforts to protect and preserve our natural environment. And then lastly, there was a number of scenario testing results that showed that scenario B had fewer environmental impacts in terms of impact on sensitive environmental areas and air quality, traffic impacts, and scenario A. Next slide. So these are kind of findings, and it's, again, just a summary of some findings. There's a lot more, obviously, that builds on this, but some potential implications for what this could mean. It could mean, for example, pursuing a more compact and less dispersed pattern for new development in the county. It could also mean limiting new growth in the rural lands and directing it to the PSA in order to achieve this kind of vision of scenario B. It could mean encouraging a larger proportion of new development to be in these compact mixed-use communities that have a mixture of densities, housing types, commercial, residential mix. And it could mean directing new growth into more redeveloped land and not just vacant land. And on the right is the images that were in the alternative survey to show how this future vision could look. You could see more compact developments, variety of lot sizes, housing types, variety of uses that preserves more open space, both in the PSA and in the rural lands. Next slide. That was nature and environment. Community character, the second public input theme. You can see on the right, there was a 173% margin of preference for the images slides, 149% margin of preference for the number slides for scenario B over scenario A. Some of the results from the public input and the scenario testing, there was a 16% satisfaction gap. In other words, the importance of this issue versus how well we were doing in protecting community character. 81% of respondents in the citizen survey felt that the number of lots for rural property should be reduced. In addition, 81% felt that property development rights in rural areas should be purchased to reduce the development potential in these rural areas. And then from the scenario testing, scenario B had more developed land close to scenic and historic resources and less developed land that was close to environmentally sensitive areas. So next slide. What these results could mean in terms of policy development. It could mean implementing standards, controls, and measures to help preserve rural character in the comprehensive plan or through regulatory measures. It could mean directing new growth into the PSA and away from rural lands. And then within the PSA, the third bullet there, it could mean implementing design standards for higher density development that occurs in the PSA to maintain a higher design quality and sensitivity and compatibility with the surrounding context. And finally, it could mean concentrating some of the new growth into compact mixed-use patterns that would reduce travel times and congestion levels as shown by the scenario testing. On the right are images of what this could look like, showing an aerial photo of a mixed-use walkable community with a variety of housing types and a ground-level photo of a range of housing that would be single-family detached, attached, multifamily, and development located as infill and on redeveloped land, as more so than on vacant land. Next slide. Third issue is affordable housing. You can see there's a 146% margin of preference on the images slide, 150% margin of preference on the numbers for scenario B over A. Some of the results we heard from the citizen survey, this issue received the highest satisfaction gap, or I guess the lowest satisfaction compared to importance for how we were doing to provide affordable housing. In addition, the citizen surveys showed that 79% of respondents felt that there should be a greater variety and mix of housing types and prices in the county. And from the November summit, it showed that 84% of people believed that it was very important or somewhat important for the county to do more to provide housing opportunities. And then on the scenario testing, as you recall, this wasn't exactly an economic modeling of affordable housing. It was more modeling of land use and housing types. But it did show that scenario B had significantly more opportunities to provide affordable housing types than scenario A through a greater range, diversity, mixture of housing types in that scenario. Next slide. So what could this mean for policy development? It could mean pursuing policies that encourage the building of a diversity of housing types that are more affordable, and by virtue of that, available to a wider range of income groups, including allowing housing types or higher density housing that is close to employment, amenities, and multimodal transportation, and encouraging more mixed use place types that has mixed housing types, close to employment, commercial area, shopping, as part of this complete community concept that's discussed more in the third part of the white paper. On the right is an image from the alternative survey showing that development is in a range of housing types, and these ranges of housing types allow for a wider range of price points that creates more options for affordable housing. Next slide. The fourth issue is economic development. You can see the preference margin was 168% on the images slides, 171% on the numbers slides. This issue also had a 20% satisfaction gap from the citizen survey. Citizen survey also showed that 70% of people felt that it was very important or somewhat important for the county to do more to expand the local economy by attracting higher paying jobs. And then finding from the forecast of the Hampton Roads Planning District Commission for population employment, their forecast showed that by 2045, the county would have 165% population growth, but only 115% employment growth. So if this forecast proved to be correct, that could lead to a potential imbalance in a jobs to housing ratio, tending more towards, if you will, a bedroom community for the county. The scenario testing results, the fiscal impact modeling, actually showed that scenario A yielded a higher net fiscal return than scenario B in 25 years, although both scenarios showed a net positive fiscal impact for the county. And then finally, the computer modeling showed that scenario B had a much higher density of employment on parcels than scenario A, so more high density, more kind of employment per acre than scenario A, as well as a significantly higher proportion of jobs in these mixed-use place types. That some research, both of these issues, high density and mixed use, some research has shown that these are preferred or favorable for both employers and workforce that attract these higher wage type of jobs that people said they wanted. So the next slide, the implications of this for policy development include encouraging the development of these complete communities that mix this employment, housing, and a series of community amenities in a setting that is walkable and accessible and bikeable. Encouraging the building of these lively new town and village centers that have the sufficient density of jobs, people, and amenities that have been shown to attract these high-quality, high-wage businesses and employers. And finally, allowing some large lot single-family development types in future growth to ensure a balance of housing types, income groups, and promote good fiscal balance. And that last point is based on the finding that scenario A, with more single-family detached housing, actually had a slightly higher net fiscal return. So it's basically just showing that there should be a balance of some single-family dwelling, large lot, as well as some more compact and higher density types of housing. And how that could look on the right from the alternative survey, just showing some of these mixed-use place type and building types, Main Street kind of shopping environment with housing on top and lively kind of town and village centers. Next slide. And the final citizen input issue was quality of life. You can see that this had, actually I think this one had the highest margin of preference. For the images slide, 227% preference for B over A and 171% on the numbers slides. And some of the other results, the 2019 summit in November showed there was a need for additional bike, ped, and transit improvements, and connecting the places that people want to go in the county. The citizen survey showed that 80% of respondents felt that it was important to develop an interconnected street system to avoid traffic, and 78% felt that farmland was more important than development. It's kind of a quality of life issue in the way that survey was structured. And then from the computer testing, it showed that scenario B led to population being closer to bus or walking networks. And there was, even though there were no future school sites cited on this, there was a much higher potential for walk access to future school sites because of the relatively more compact nature of the development pattern in scenario B. Next slide. So the policy implications for these findings are potentially reducing some portions of the PSA area on land that is currently vacant in order to increase the amount of rural lands, because that was seen as such a valued and important part of quality of life, was having these protected rural lands. Promoting more active transportation, easy access to shopping, restaurants, and services within new communities, particularly bike and walk access. Concentrating new growth in more compact and mixed-use patterns, which was shown in the computer testing to reduce travel times and congestion levels countywide. Constructing more bicycle and pedestrian options, as well as more street connectivity and fewer dead-end cul-de-sac patterns, again, to improve connectivity and reduce traffic congestion. And then finally, both maintaining the current major parks that are so highly valued and building more pocket parks and parks that are actually within the heart of communities, some of these new mixed-use complete communities. Next slide. So those are, for your consideration, some of the policy implications, potential policy implications of the findings from both the public input and the scenario testing. And then the second part of the white paper on the preferred scenario framework was a map. And there's a number of notes and kind of qualifiers on what this map means. I won't read through all of it, but the most important thing is to remember that this is a concept map. It's not a specific proposal for future land uses. It's not a future land use map. It's based on the scenario testing that showed, and the alternatives questionnaire that showed a preference for the scenario that was shown in, for the pattern that was shown in scenario B. And most importantly, the locations of place types, even though they look like they're site-specific, they are just one possible pattern of growth that expresses the vision in the scenario narrative. But they shouldn't be taken as the only pattern that could express this vision. And then finally, a relationship to the current comp plan and zoning map. So this is really a snapshot of one way that development could look in 2045. It doesn't tell you how we achieve this necessarily, and it doesn't necessarily conform to the current comp plan or the zoning ordinance, or the pattern of entitlement in the by right lots and approved subdivisions, because it's a 25-year look. All these things can change over time. Zoning, future land use designations can change. Even the entitlements of private development can change, and revisions can be requested to deal with changing market conditions. So the next slide, with those qualifiers in mind, is some big ideas that are embodied in this framework map. Number one is limiting new residential development in the rural lands based on all the things that were heard and what was presented in the scenario narrative. It shows a lot less residential development in rural lands. Number two is potentially reducing the PSA in currently undeveloped areas. So there's a couple of areas in the bright green that show areas that are currently vacant that could potentially be used to narrow the PSA and preserve more land in the rural lands designation. Number three is potential redesignation of land that is some low-density residential areas designated in the current comp plan to mixed use, mixed residential commercial areas in this case, or some land into mixed commercial industrial areas, for example, existing economic opportunity areas. So that's consistent with the vision for creating more of these mixed-use pods and place types within the county for the future. Number 4 is redesignating some low-density areas to moderate or higher density designations. And this would do 2 things. One, it would be conducive to a mixture of housing types that could present more affordable housing opportunities, and it could help realize this idea of more compact development that is better from a traffic standpoint and from an environmental and community character standpoint, potentially. And lastly, redesignating some existing commercial areas and or revising the zoning in these, particularly where they are just straight retail, to encourage more of a mixture of uses in these areas. So those are the big ideas in the framework map. Again, it's more the pattern than the actual location of what land use goes on what parcel that we should be looking at here. But next slide, the final part of the white paper was additional planning concepts. And this was some food for thought, if you will, as you consider how to build this new policy framework, as well as how to implement some of the ideas. These are a series of concepts taken from best practices from current professional practice on how you might do that, including designing with nature, so specific design techniques that would make future development more sensitive to the natural context. Number 2, rural character protection, so creating this kind of new vision for rural progress that is not just based on farming, but also includes some other economic growth potential through agritourism, heritage tourism, nature tourism, things like that. Number 3 is fleshing out that whole complete communities concepts and talking about current market demand for these walkable mixed-use communities. Number 4 is a discussion of housing flexibility, and particularly the imbalance right now in housing supply and housing demand, particularly for these missing middle housing types. Number 5, placemaking for economic development, and that talks about this new paradigm for attracting high-wage employers and workforce through these attractive, vibrant, mixed-use town centers and communities. And finally, connectivity and transportation choices. It really picks up on that demand for active transportation that we're seeing nationwide and some of the responses that we've heard in the surveys and the citizen input for walking, biking trails, things like that. So that is the kind of tour of what's in the white paper. I'm sure you have a lot of questions and follow-up discussion. The bulk of this meeting really is for your discussion, but I wanted to turn it over to Leanne before we kind of turn it back to you to talk about some of the implications for how we take everything we've heard and really build a revised or refined policy framework.
Thanks, Vlad. You can jump to the next slide, 22. Great, thank you. So this is going to be kind of an overview discussion. You'll get more detail at your next meeting on October 5th, but we wanted to start the discussion today in thinking about how we would use all the information that we've been collecting and ideas that have been generated to revise the plan framework. And the first most important piece is to say that we're starting from the 2035 comprehensive plan that is in existence in an adoption today. There's been a lot of discussion over the last several months, and particularly coming out of the first round of public engagement, that there's a lot of reaffirmation of what is in that 2035 plan. And so, you could almost characterize this as a refinement of your current plan, looking through a new set of eyes and looking at some new information. And so what I'm going to do is just walk you through some of the key components that we are going to be kind of using to begin this discussion on how we're going to revise the plan framework. So there are several things that are important to this discussion. We have several pieces of information that we're going to be using, and you might have heard us talking about kind of the cumulative public engagement inputs, and that's how we envision this. So while we just conducted a survey that was focused on the comprehensive plan goals and the scenarios, we want to look at the totality of all of the engagement information we've received. And the first one of those is the 2019 Citizen Survey. The second was the information we received out of the Engage 2045 round one of public engagement. The second round that we've just completed, in which the community participation team is completing their review of that. We also want to consider other considerations, best practices from the planning field, et cetera. We want to incorporate those ideas into this discussion, and also think about the scenario planning work and also other technical analysis. They're going to play a role in helping to revise the plan framework as well. And of course, all of your conversations as the working group are going to be fundamental to revising this over time. So for this first part, we're going to spend just a moment talking about the vision. I think if you click, there should be a little arrow there that focuses, on the vision piece, and you can go to the next slide. So the vision in the currently adopted plan and vision statements in all comprehensive plans are really the highest level of aspirational statement for the plan. It really helps the reader kind of paint a picture in their head of what this community's future is going to look like. And Vlad did a great job of kind of going through and looking at their current towards 2035 vision statement and color coding different elements that are included in that vision statement that correspond to the public input priorities that came out of the first round of engagement. And through that analysis, really found that there's a lot of overlap and consistency with these 5 public engagement priorities, public input priorities, and the statements that you have in your current vision statement and your plan. If you go to the next slide, you can see this blown up a little bit closer. So you can see here the 5 public input priorities. We originally called them themes, and you'll see those corresponding colors showing up in the text, and that just shows where those inputs kind of came into the vision statement. And if you go to the next slide, these are just a couple of examples blown up. I know it's hard to read probably the previous slide, but these are just a few examples of how the themes are showing up in the vision statement. So related to nature, there's language about preserving our special natural and cultural heritage. Related to community character, there's language about preserving our special natural and cultural heritage and a special place to live and work. With respect to affordable housing, there's a statement about providing a variety of housing options. For economic development, there's a statement about industries offer quality employment opportunities that are compatible with the county's goals. And then for quality of life, there's language about upholding the identity as an exceptional area to visit and a special place to live and work. So if you go to the next slide, there's just some kind of summary impressions and ideas as we looked at this. And that is that the public input priorities are well represented in the current 2035 vision statement, and no other substantive topics were really included in that vision statement that are outside of those 5 public input priorities. Couple of ideas to consider as we think about how we might want to refine the vision statement. It could be reorganized to be based on the 2045 public input priorities to kind of raise those priorities in terms of relevance in the plan and how it's structured. That's one way to consider it, kind of revamping it. A few other adjustments to consider, maybe making the affordable housing direction a little bit more clear. and potentially based on the policy direction that comes out of this planning effort. And then finally, strengthening community character direction in the vision statement as well. So again, these are just preliminary impressions and ideas to start the conversation and give you some of the kind of guidance in terms of what we've been seeing and looking at these. So now if we go to the next slide, we're going to talk about, if you click again, we'll talk about the goals, strategies, and actions. And of course, in this last round of engagement, we asked a very specific question about how respondents would be interested in either keeping the current goal or refining it. And so we have good information on that, but we also have good information on strategies and actions as part of, again, the collective public inputs that we've been receiving. If you go to the next slide. And similar to the vision, we want to start with the current plans, goals, strategies, and actions as the starting point for understanding, what we're working with and what we should be revising moving forward. So again, we're going to consider all of those collective public inputs, other planning considerations, the technical analysis, and of course the conversations you all will have about different policy directions to be exploring. Go to the next slide. Again, our just kind of initial impressions and ideas, and we'll have more detailed information for each goal topic to discuss at the next meeting. But just wanted to give you kind of an overview to start during this meeting. What we're finding when we look at the goals, and I believe you all have seen some of the preliminary feedback on the from the round 2 engagement. There's varying level of support for maintaining the goals, all 9 goals. And when I say varying, there's fairly strong. I mean, more than half the respondents voted or polled to keep the goal, each of the 9 goals. But there was more support for some more than others. And we want to consider the outcomes of the community participation team's theming exercises that they just wrapped up last week. So I think that'll be important, along with the whole cumulative public engagement feedback that we've received. With regard to strategies and actions, we took a look at all the current strategies and actions in the 2035 plan and compared that to what we've learned thus far in terms of the public sentiments, and they generally correlate with what we're seeing. We think it is going to be important to kind of walk through each of these independently and think about how they could be refined, and that really is going to be based on, again, all of the public inputs received, your working group input, and some other ideas and suggestions from planning best practices that we'll offer to you. Next slide. And I think that wraps up my piece to this. And I believe maybe we pause here before we go into schedule and next steps and see if there are any questions or comments that you all might have.
Any questions?
This is Jack Haldeman. I have one, and thank you. It's a nice presentation. The slide here says October 27th, joint meeting will cover public input, preferred scenario, policy considerations, and land use applications. There was also a reference on page 4 on that same meeting that was going to have land use recommendations. And I just kind of wanted to get a better idea of what this meeting is going to cover. So the land use applications, we have 13 land use applications. Are we going to be making some recommendations on that? Or when it said land use recommendations on page 4, what did that cover? What kind of recommendations are we expected to make and that sort of thing?
This is Vlad speaking. Just wondered, Mr. Haldeman, page 4 of what you were referring to?
Of this today's presentation. If you just scroll back to page 4. Yeah, way down at the bottom it says PCBOS meeting.
Oh, gotcha.
Public input stuff. It says land use recommendations. What does that mean?
Yeah, I think I can address that. this probably schedule was done before we kind of put this slide presentation together. And I think land use recommendations is really more land use considerations. So that needs to be revised. I think in the next meeting, you'll see that's been revised. We're not proposing to make recommendations for the land use applications. The whole point of that joint meeting, and you can see that slide shows a similar agenda basically to what we're talking about today, is to get in front of the board all the kind of findings from the public input, all the results of the scenario testing, and then these policy considerations, land use considerations and policy considerations, really so that there's no big surprise for them that this is, where this process is to date and what it's kind of suggesting. And then on the land use applications, staff can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I think it was just to get those in front of the board, not to, make recommendations one way or the other, but just to show the whole package of things that they can see it at once.
Okay. Thank you.
And this is Rich. My understanding is that the actual land use applications, there's a future meeting where we are going to dig into each one of those individually. And so as Vlad said, this is just sort of an overview right here of what's been received. But we'll actually do a major review at a future meeting.
When do I'm sorry, Richard, you finished?
No, go ahead. No, I'm finished.
I should have used my raised hand. I'm sorry, but when do the land use map that was drawn up here is conceptual? I understand that. When does it become more specific? When do we go through and say? I assume, first of all, I assume we're all talking about scenario B here or some other scenario. Scenario A is certainly resoundingly rejected. That's my assumption. But we're going to have another land use map. And will we get specific on turning that conceptual map into specific parcels and specific areas, tightening up the PSA, as Vlad mentioned? Where exactly we're going to put these higher density residential areas and which areas are we going to protect and that sort of thing. Do we get specific at some point?
Yeah, Ellen, you may want to add to this, but just to kick it off, responding to your question, this is Vlad again. Definitely there is a part in the process where these kind of concepts get translated into ideas for specific future land use changes on the map. The schedule right now, and we're not kind of purposely trying not to talk too much about the schedule for the end of the year at this meeting, because that is an agenda topic for next meeting. But the schedule has it sometime in November. So after the October 27th joint PCBOS meeting, where there's kind of hopefully an affirmation, acknowledgement that what we've heard and what we're showing in a preliminary sense makes sense. So go forward, start crafting potential changes to the future land use map would be done in November. And that would be done before the next round of public engagement, so that there'd be something to share with the public on what that future land use map could look like. I think the slides that Ellen was going to go over talk about what, the next Planning Commission Working Group meeting would be talking about the schedule and the sequence of meetings through the end of the year that would include all those. Is that right, Ellen?
Yes, that all sounds right to me. Yep. And I think as far as the land use applications, as mentioned earlier, staff would be doing some further analysis of those to bring to you specifically. And as part of that analysis, looking at sort of consistency or potential inconsistency with sort of the preferred scenario framework.
Mr. Polster, you had your hand up. Frank? I think you're still muted.
I'm piggybacking on Jack's question, and I'm still a little confused about the meeting with the board on the 28th. And so let me be blunt about this. Do you intend to show the preferred map B to the board?
This is Vlad again. This is one of the things that we were hoping you all, the Plan Commission Working Group, could affirm or change our direction on. So if you agree, then we would do basically the same presentation with any refinements you've made to that joint meeting on October 27th. That would include, yes, this conceptual map and the policy direction implications.
I'm very uncomfortable about that without hearing, as I've said several times, without hearing some response to that from the other commissioners and some discussion on that. And I've asked for that every time. And now we're still marching to this idea of taking this thing to the board without that discussion.
Well, that's why we have the 3 meetings, Frank, scheduled prior to the 27th, and that's a huge part of our meetings is going to be to discuss just that. And I've talked to Tammy and Ellen about what a high interest item that is on the part of the whole PC working group.
I wouldn't have a problem with that as long as the read-ahead that's scheduled to go in after the meeting of the 5th, somewhere between, and then published on the 20th, that as long as it didn't contain that preferred map until there is a discussion. Mm-hmm. And so having said that, let me go back and talk about some of the reservations based on this briefing today that came out. And I'm not going to be critical about the methodology or how they did the mapping thing and the assumptions they made on the by rights and shifting zoning and things like that. They get to make that as their scenario. I mean, but there should be a realization that there is an alternative to that scenario that should be discussed. And it should be examined, the preferred scenario should be examined to see if, in fact, it matches up with the 5 opportunities in the gap analysis. So let me go back to what I asked in the last meeting about the survey that we just took. And we just saw the images pieces weighted for it. What was missing out of that was the map, which is in the attachment on page 7. And on page 7, I did the weighting piece for that. And so I asked the last time, there's 134 surveyed, of which 90 folks, or 67%, answered that. And you said, okay, we'll go back, look at it. Now you come back and weighted the scores, and the difference between scenario A on that map and scenario B is a total of 304 versus something else, and there's only a difference of 54. So how did we get 118% from that weighting? Now, I'm saying this based on the original comment, and you brought it up, and you're exactly right. The survey that was done by the University of Virginia for 219 was statistically valid. Tell me about your MapQuest survey and whether you think it's statistically valid. Question.
Okay, this is Vlad. I'll take a crack at it, Mr. Polster. So the MapQuest survey, the Exploring Our Future Alternatives survey, that was not intended to be a statistically valid survey, in that it's not randomized. It's not like the 2019 Citizen Survey. And it was a survey that included the map and the images and the numbers, as you recall. So, and they had different kind of margins of preference. You're right. And I just looked back at it. I think it's on page 54 of the white paper. Yeah, there was, if you look at the margin of preference, 300 on the map portion of the survey, 360 kind of weighted value. That's number of stars time number of respondents for scenario B versus 304 for scenario A, which is 118% margin of preference. And yeah, that's lower on the map than it is on the other like images and numbers ones. I totally agree with the points you made, that it's not statistically valid, and it was not intended to be. It's supposed to be garnering people's impressions based on 3 different ways of looking at this scenario, from a map, image, or number standpoint. So
I don't
hope
think
that answers your question.
Because the difference of 54, how does 54 translate to 118%?
So the overall methodology for coming up with this margin of preference was just taking the number of respondents times the number of stars, and then just comparing the, how much was one weighted value higher than the other, 118% higher for B than for A.
Vlad, a difference of 54 does not translate to 118% between those two.
Well, the difference of 360 versus 304, 360 is 118% higher than 304 is basically that calculation.
That's new math for me, but let me move on, because there were a couple other things that you talked about during your presentation that I thought were really interesting. And it comes down to, in your methodology, how you've moved things around in terms of employees and population of these other dense areas. And in your control figures that you used the population figure of 119,905 for it. And I'm assuming that figure came out of the HRTPO socioeconomic for 2045. And that figure actually was 127.41. Is that correct, or is that just an error in your paper?
Boy, I have to admit I can't answer that on the fly. I'd have to look at that.
Well, let me go on, because
email follow-up, yeah.
Yeah, you'll go back and you'll find it, because the figure you used for employee exactly matched the 45,921. Now, the reason I'm going into that level of detail is that the associated comment about the economic development, you essentially said because there's only essentially a 5,816 increase in employment from 2015 to 2045, that we're really a bedroom community. And so when you go and take the worker figures for those differences, there's actually an increase of 19,908 workers by 2045, which should tell you that what? We're a bedroom community. And so if we are a bedroom community, and I would agree with your MapQuest survey, because I think it's consistent with the 2019 UVA study, as well as the December, about those gap analysis, I want to be able to test whether or not that's true or not by looking at your preferred map. And as you and I both know, based on the conversation that we've gone through with Ellen over the last 3 weeks, you can generate a specific location to the parcel based on the data you provided me. And I want to test that and have a discussion with folks to see if, in fact, it doesn't impact the environment. Okay? Does it impact the traffic? Yes or no? And this is based on your data. And that's the type of level of detail and discussion that I would like to see before we even think about a preferred map going to the board.
No, it's a fair point. As I understand what you're saying, that regardless of the overall pattern that's shown in scenario B, you want to be able to test on an individual parcel or an individual road or watershed or what have you, just what is the impact of that. And I guess I would say that all that is possible theoretically, because the way the model is done allows us to do that. However, it would involve some more analysis, additional time to do that, because what our mission was here was to create county-wide results. And the beauty of this modeling is that it can provide site-specific impacts too. However, the way our scope of our process is written, that's to be done more at the final kind of leave behind model. When you have a new future land use map, and you can plug that into all three of these models, fiscal impact and travel and land use, and then you can make these kind of site-specific judgments about, well, does this parcel really increase our traffic on this road, or does this development pattern create this kind of fiscal return? It's probably inefficient to do that at the scenario planning stage because it takes a lot of time to do that, and it's a very hypothetical point in the process where all we're trying to do is show the overall countywide effect of one potential narrative, one scenario hypothesis, if you will.
I think what I'm trying to do is get to what an alternative to yours is. And I don't think it would surprise you to know that I'm not asking you to generate that because I've already done it. And I'm ready to send it now to everybody so that we can take a look at it and have a discussion.
What exactly did you generate, Frank?
Vlad sent me his data that he used to generate his maps and his methodology. Mm-hmm. And he and I went back and forth. And so I was able to take that data where he said, okay, we're going to put high density residential. I was able to take that data that he provided me and I could collate it exactly to a parcel using the GIS data from the county. Mm-hmm. And his data. And I overlaid it on a set of GIS maps. I also took his data that they provided on the traffic, as well as I have the data from the Hampton Roads Transportation Organization, which generated his data. And I have that too in the GIS system. And so you can take a look at, let's say, even though I've asked the question that you're going to double the population for that eastern state traffic analysis zone, but you can't tell me what the traffic impact is when I already know there's a severe congested area, according to the Hampton Roads Transportation Study, between 199 and Depew and Long Hill. So, I mean, if it's already severe by 2040, that's their projection, what will a doubling of the population with Eastern State bring to us? That's a type of discussion I would like to hear about the different areas. And so I've got very specific pieces on that. And frankly, there's some of these things that I agree, because one of the things that's in the methodology is the staff has generated parcels in that model, the preferred model, that they put in there that should be there. And I think I know which ones those are. But, I'd like some confirmation to make sure that I know what I'm talking about by having a discussion. The staff is willing to do it. I'm going to send the paper out and we'll find out.
Yeah. I think it would be an interesting read. I'm grappling, to be perfectly honest, with the idea that, from what I gather in going through the package, that scenario map for B is just totally hypothetical, saying, oh, well, there might be mixed use in this zone, or the development will go out of the rural lands, and whereas yours is very, very specific, I'm gathering. And so my question is going to be, I guess my question is almost would be taking the hypothetical scenario map and being able to use your specifics to evaluate some of these ideas.
Yeah, let me give you two examples, Rich, real quick, that I agree with what scenario B does. There's several areas I agree. And one of the things that they did is in the Stonehouse Reserve and Riverfront Reserve, those areas that now have an easement and it can only be developed up to 100 acres in agriculture, they took that out of the PSA. Hooray! I'm glad they did that. They took portions of the Moortown, Hillcrest, Hill Pleasant Farm, about almost 60 to 70% of that total area, and took it out of the EO, so that it's now rural lands, which it is now, as opposed to if it got master planned, it got put in. So there are some things in there that I absolutely agree with, from both that agree with what the survey says about what they don't want,
Mhm.
and conforms, in fact, to the policy, the GSAs of the current 2045.
Okay.
My last point to this thing is that when they dismiss the by right piece, the population growth that they've moved around for 2045 is based on the by right parcels. And so with the 15,291 by right parcels within the PSA that we essentially have 80% of the capacity to meet the 2045 population growth.
Mhm.
Why do you want to add more density into areas that end up causing more traffic, more congestion, and more impacts on the environment?
Okay.
We don't need to make some of those decisions today.
Mhm.
And we shouldn't try to tell the board, who is brutally aware of that number.
Mhm.
So
No, I'd like to see your the report, and I mean the whole working group and staff, and I'm sure the consultants also would be included in that.
Well, Rich, I'm glad you said that, because I just hit the send button.
All right, Frank.
Okay, and so when everybody gets the email, you're going to get two things. You're going to get an invitation to go and look at the edit and share the document, which is on a Google Drive because it's so large, as well as I've got an online version of it. And so the people that I'm sharing this with, you can share it with anybody else, but it's gone. Yeah,
and I think, and I don't want to hog. I'm going to open it up for other hands. I saw Jack had one, but I can almost see the conceptual land use map with an accompanying considerations page highlighting a couple of things you just mentioned, for example, but where you can look at the map conceptually, but you also have notes on the reality, like the 80% of demand, is already there, and so on and so forth. So I think we might even be able to blend the two, but I thank you for all that extra work that you've done. And let me see if there's any other hands up. I know Jack had his hand up earlier, and I do not see anybody.
My hand's up.
Oh, okay. There you go. Okay.
Yeah. I was just wondering if we're going to get a copy of this presentation today. I know it's very similar to the read ahead, but could we have that forwarded to us also, please?
Certainly, yeah. I think there are some sort of minor formatting changes. Hopefully that you're not noticing anything too different, but yeah, definitely glad to give you the updated version.
Thanks. Also, I had sent in 6 or 7 weeks ago some land use change suggestions or recommendations that I think are germane to this discussion on conceptual place map. So just for that. And Frank, I just got your email, so thank you.
Okay. All right. Yes, and I remember your comments, Jack, and I think we were going to delve into them on the land use issue, but maybe in light of this conversation, they could be included when we start discussing the conceptual land use map, and as well as Frank's package that he just sent out. Okay. Anybody else? I see Ginny. And you're on mute. No, you're not.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. I just had a question for Vlad. In the paper, on the white paper on the preferred scenario framework, Appendix 2 was drafted, apparently dated December of 2019, and it left me wondering if this was the final, what the final decisions were about what to include in the no build layer, because this sounded all very unsettled as I read it. And so I couldn't decide what was actually included in the no build layer.
Yes, good point. So yeah, we included, as we went, we created these kind of technical documentation memos, and that's what that date refers to in there. We did go back when we put these appendices in and make sure that there's nothing in there that was just wrong, that we didn't do, or said we did and didn't. So there's nothing wrong here, but yeah, you'll notice that some of the things are not finalized in these. We'd be happy to go back and any questions you have on whether something was done or not. So for example, I know in that Appendix 2, which is the documentation on the no bill layer, it said Chesapeake Bay, RMA would be provisional depending on the scenario. We didn't have the scenarios yet, but yeah, that was a no bill layer. So there was nothing shown in the RMA, things like that. But
okay, so at the very end, it says, for example, using both methods, the modelers could remove some no-build features and use others as suitability detractors to repel growth in the population and employment allocations. And so that, all of that, they could do this, they could do that, both methods do this, and that left me very uncertain about what is actually included in the no-build layer. And I mean, maybe it's too strong a suggestion just to go back and edit that appendix to clarify what is and what isn't.
good point. Yeah, we'd be happy to include a sheet in there of what the final no build layer is. Yeah.
Thank you. I mean, because
I'm bringing that up
because it affects so much of the nature, green space, all of that kind of considerations.
Sure. That's some of the refinements we can put into this, and that's why it's great to have your review of this, as Mr. Croft said, over the next couple of meetings too, just to make sure that this, we consider this a draft, and if there's things that you all would like to see changed or added to or clarified, we're happy to do that.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Jenny. Jack, you have your hand up again, I believe?
Oh, no, I didn't mean to.
No, okay. Yep. All righty. Okay. All right. Anybody else? All right. Ellen, if you want to move on to the next step then on the meeting today.
Sure. This mainly kind of recaps things we've already talked about the sequence here, about being able to revisit this discussion at our next meeting, how we will have to put some placeholder materials together as we start the process of getting the packet for the board meeting done, but that those materials won't be distributed to the board or seen by the board until the 20th. And again, just that there's the parallel activities of the CPT going on. So we'll be bringing the final report on public input to you all going into that work session. Next slide. So yeah, I think just trying to have the discussion today, as we already had a good discussion, and if there's some additional discussion right after my slides, we'd be glad to go on looking at specific things or answering questions, and then continuing to next meeting. And next slide. Some things we were hoping to check in with you about next time, just hoping to kind of have affirmation of those high-level preferred scenario framework and policy considerations framework, check in with you all about the Planning Commission Working Group on its preferred role and whether the approach to date is in keeping with your expectations or if any alteration is desired. And then as part of the packet materials for the next meeting, you'll see some additional information about the draft or planned sequence of meeting topics going through the end of the year. So we already touched on that a little bit at the meeting today, but hopefully we can revisit that with you all once you've seen that information and seek affirmation there. So that's really all I had. Again, glad to have further discussion today.
Okay.
Desired, as shown on the next slide.
Thanks, Ellen. Jack? No. Okay. Anybody else? Well, that is one of the, we've touched on a number of items, and one of the things that struck me, and this is more a question of how other jurisdictions go about doing this. My impression, regardless of what this future land use map will look like in the comp plan, that scenario B is a sea change in a lot of areas from what the James City County has been doing. And given the fact that it's a 25-year look ahead, but how, considering that boards of supervisors will change, demographics will change over time, how do jurisdictions or communities that decide they want to embrace this future look, whatever it's going to be, how do they go about implementing it without getting sidetracked when the political composition of a board changes one election and then back again another? Is there, or does this just remain sort of a living document that is, 1 year, one of the goals might make the county strategic plan for funding, and then another year something else. And I don't want to make this a rambling question, but I'm just sort of wondering whether there is a master plan that gets put together by communities to say, well, we need to start addressing these ordinance changes if we're going to make this future scenario a reality.
Well, I could take a crack at, I didn't know, Mr. Croft, if you're asking the planning team or your fellow commissioners or...
Yeah, actually, I was just getting. You're the one I was directing it to, Vlad, because you've seen a number of communities with different plans and implementation processes.
Yeah, I'll give an initial response, but Leanne has much broader experience beyond Virginia too. So, one example I think it's good is Loudoun County, because I have a fairly long-term familiarity with how their policy development has happened over the decades even. So they had a big comprehensive plan, sea change, as you describe it, in 1994 with their choices and changes comprehensive plan. I guess I would say that not everything, when you do that kind of big change, not everything gets implemented and not everything survives the next comp plan cycle, but a number of things did. So it is a living document, and the comprehensive plan gets revised and refined. But a lot of the kind of big picture concepts that they had for things like villages and hamlets and preserving that kind of rural buffer west of Route 15 had a life, beyond different political changes. At some point that got implemented through a new zoning framework that called for larger lot zoning in the rural areas there. So it's if you think of it as a forward process, it might be 3 steps forward, 1 or 2 back, but a net gain of 1 in kind of successive comprehensive plan cycles in achieving, a vision that gets refined over time.
Okay. Thank you. Leanne?
Leanne, do you?
Yeah, I was just going to add that I think being, and I think you've done this, in past planning efforts too, and we're building on that and maybe moving even further beyond in our approach to really develop a plan based on quantifiable guidance that we were receiving from the community. So this is very much a community plan. It's not just one board of supervisors plan, if you will. And I think that can be really helpful to maintain continuity over time. The other thing that I think is really important is that your community developed the strategic plan and the direct linkage between the strategic plan and the comprehensive plan and the strategic plan and budgeting, capital investment decisions, and developing departmental work plans. And so I think there's those very purposeful connections will help your community. And this will be fun because this will be the first round of updating the comp plan, then updating your strategic plan to include the new policy guidance included within the comp plan. And that strategic plan will go through and identify any new implementation initiatives that need to be prioritized. And then that process will allow for a look at what your kind of fiscal situation is in terms of, when can we fund and do these things? Do we have the staff to do them? That sort of thing, and be very thoughtful about making those decisions and prioritizing. There will be an opportunity, again, like we did the last time, to prioritize with the community which of these things need to happen sooner rather than later. So again, really kind of building from the comprehensive plan. And I think that's a step that a lot of communities historically have not done. And so these plans are great, but they don't maybe get as fully implemented as they could have if they were, but with this process to be more purposeful and thoughtful about tying all of these pieces together, I think really suggests, one, more consistency over time in maintaining the guidance in the plan, and two, actually implementing the plan, given the, kind of fiscal and staff capacity considerations that you all have to deal with over time.
Okay, thank you. And I see some hands, and I'll go with Tammy, and then Tim and Ginny. So Tammy, please go ahead.
Great. I just wanted to thank you. I wanted to provide some historical perspective and kind of talk about how this process is a little bit different. I know that in the past, we've really gotten into a routine of, collecting public input, thinking big picture, but then when it comes to land use map changes, really taking them, parcel by parcel. And some of the feedback that we've received during those comp plan cycles has been this disappointment that we haven't looked at it in the aggregate. So, if we look at, this parcel and this parcel and this parcel for their individual impacts, what does that mean cumulatively in terms of impacts to the environment or to the transportation network or what have you? And so this process is an attempt to turn that upside down and to do an initial stage of evaluation to see, if we go in general direction, regarding some increased densities inside the PSA and decreased densities outside the PSA, the different aspects that Vlad was talking about on one of those slides where it was highlighting different policy distinctions between scenario B and scenario A. What does that mean? And I think, the quantification of that is exactly what the MetroQuest survey was trying to put out there and see what the public reaction was. And so, again, this is this conceptual framework plan is not our final land use map. It is just an interim step, so to speak, to establish what the vision might be, tested against some of the modeling capabilities that we have. But there are future steps where we can, really go a level deeper and see, what are the specifics related to some of these parcels. We know that generally it might be a good idea. What does it mean when we look at it at a deeper level and get some more public input? look at some of the input that we get from our different agencies and do that typical parcel by parcel specific analysis that you're used to. So I just want to put that out there as a caution that we're not jumping straight to the final product at this point.
Okay, thank you.
Ellen, I don't know if there's any or Vlad, any clarifications you want to make against what I just said. I guess I would just say I think an idea was brought up earlier to, potentially if this goes forward to the board, sort of have an accompanying set of notes from the Planning Commission working group, whether they be some high-level considerations for the board or some specific areas or suggestions that I know several of you have already mentioned, or whatever was in the material for Mr. Polster today. So procedurally, I think we can certainly, if it suited you all, wrap that together into a piece like that.
Yeah, I'm thinking that might be a good approach, at least to plan to move towards. So thank you, Ellen. Tim, you had your hand up?
Yeah, thanks, Rich. A couple clarifications, I guess I would like to understand. So for Vlad, you referenced multimodal transportation. So can you define that for the group?
Sure. Multimodal transportation is basically, allowing for all travel modes: automobile, bicycle, bus, transit, walking. So it's this idea that streets used to be primarily for cars and, pretty far down on the priority list, pedestrians, and not at all for bikes. And it's rebalancing that so that all the modes have kind of good opportunities for connectivity and mobility.
Thanks. We talked, you referenced in a few places affordable housing. Do you or Leanne have successful examples in the complete communities? So I remain concerned when we talk about mixing single family townhome and then affordable housing. And I understand a lot of the townhome communities around here fall into that workforce style. But I get really concerned when we start talking about complete communities like a new town or a Loud One or something along to that effect, where the requirements, for parks, recreational facilities, stormwater, all those pieces create an onerous, monthly homeowners association bill that it becomes no longer affordable. So I would be curious as we move this forward to hear about some successful examples of the complete community and how affordable housing was incorporated at a higher percentage than just, the 4 or 5% that we often see in the larger communities here. And then there was a comment about PDR, buying PDR outside the PSA. First and foremost, I'm not a fan of PDR. That's just my editorial comment, and I'll leave it at that. But I certainly don't think lands outside the PSA, which are not in danger of being developed, should be qualified as eligible for the PDR. Then there was another comment about farmland, that people's preference was the farmland. And, I remain still concerned that folks don't understand what rural lands is versus farmlands versus what's within the PSA. You know, my backyard is Pumpkinville. You know, I'm looking at 15 acres of farm behind me that I know some of it's zoned B1. And Mr. Haldeman brought up a series of parcels that when people drive down the road, they see farmland, not understanding that they are in our land use for higher density. So I know I appreciate, you know, sharing these things, but I just feel that I feel like the responses we got from the Metro Quest don't fully align with what the definitions are. And I'm just concerned that people just have this vision of what we're trying to propose here is, you know, walking and biking trails, you know, for everybody to use adjacent to the roads, which will be winding through farmland. And, you know, I don't think that's necessarily A, the picture, and B, the future, because if we're trying to recruit people to live and move here, you know, if we're trying to recruit businesses to relocate here, we're going to have some significant changes to what we have. So I'm sorry for the long answer, but I'm just concerned that the connectivity between those who responded to the survey, those who responded to the MetroQuest, and what the plan is just aren't connected.
Okay. Thank you, Tim. And before I go to Ginny, I do see Paul wanted to say something. So if you don't mind, Ginny, we'll defer to Paul and then go to you.
No problem.
Thanks.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I just had some observations and things for the PC working group to think about sort of as a whole in recognition of where we are in the totality of the process. Probably more following on to what Tammy's end remarks were, but you know, I probably more focused as a summary comment before some of the next steps. So for some of the specific substantive ones, I would actually recommend, if it's okay with you all, to defer to Ms. Wortman for the next comments before I opine.
Okay. Ginny?
Okay. I am struggling. I think maybe I'm taking Tim's thoughts and putting them at 60,000 feet, but I'm not sure. But here's what I'm struggling with. We keep talking about how much overlap and consistency there is between the 2035 goals and the 2045 public input priorities, and how that seems to be reinforced as we go along. And lots of people don't want to change the goals that are in the 2035 plan. And yet, we come up with a map that's very different. And people clearly don't want scenario A, right, wrong, or indifferent. I mean, if whatever their level of understanding is, they voted for scenario B. And I'm struggling with, how do you present back to the Board of Supervisors and back to the public? Well, everybody thought we were on the right track, but everything is now going to look quite different. And I don't know whether anybody else sees that as a bit in a conflict, or I'm just having trouble trying to wrap my mind around how there's so much consistency and endorsement of things, and yet we come up with something that's very different looking, and how to explain that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Good point. Paul?
Could I speak first? Because this is Julie. I might have some insight.
Sure, go ahead, Julie.
I think what we go back to on that, Jenny, is the gap. Because people say that the goals are good, but we haven't met them. And so perhaps we need a new approach to move farther along to meeting those goals that we agree are good goals. Does that make sense?
That's an excellent point. Thank you.
Okay.
That's exactly right, Julie. You need to test it. Test it. And so take a look at that map, because people didn't, when they looked at that map, they didn't know what the hell they were looking at. Nobody could really tell it or even read it. That's why the percentages were so low for the comments. But test it. And then see if it meets the gap of those 5 things. And remember, all of those 5 gaps really are about one thing. It's about, I don't want things to grow. I want it to keep it this way. So we have to test it and see if it does.
Okay, thank you, Frank. Paul?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, everybody. Just so much good conversation happening today. Early on, the PC working group had really wanted more time to spend debating this very issue about what are the next steps. And certainly a lot of that conversation bore out today. Certainly the schedule that we have proposed about using some of these upcoming meetings to continue this conversation is really good. I found myself really wanting to tag on to some of Tammy's comments. This process is different, and to the degree it helps inform the PC working group and sort of help gauge whether or not you're sort of feel like you're on track or not. I would just offer some supplementary thoughts. Again, I think Tammy said it well. This is a very different approach from our last few comprehensive plans. It's certainly intended to be a comprehensive approach to where you now have these additional tools to help you get at the big picture, right? And the additional tools that we didn't have in the past that we've talked about include the scenario planning, the transportation model, and some of the fiscal analysis. Those are really, really big pieces. And again, I think Tammy said it really well before, that it's intended to sort of help supplement, helping to supplement and make this an informed process from the top down, right? And sort of not leaving you all wanting for wondering what happens countywide should, for example, the land use on the Eastern State property change. And so, I think a lot of good questions were answered today. I think a lot of good questions were asked today. I would encourage you all, though, to remember, I don't think we have to figure out but so many details over these next 3 meetings in advance of this next work session with the board. I don't think, and we'll as staff in the consultant time, as part of the consultant team, we'll spend some time looking at some of the information that Mr. Polster sent out. I don't think we're at a spot where we need to figure out parcel-specific details at this point. Remember, this is a long-range plan after all. I do think you have a lot of moving pieces. So traditionally, the analysis that will go with, I'll continue with my Eastern State example for now. The more detailed analysis that will accompany that land use decision, that land use application, will be forwarded to the commission at a later time that will be after this October one. Getting into some of the desired detailed GSAs will come at a later time. All of this will come together. I think we have a really excellent consultant team who is pulling all this information. And so, some of this stuff, I think, remember, is with scenario planning a little bit different. It's not an additive impact, right? And so the idea that, say, more traffic coming out of Eastern State will add to the existing congestion, I think, again, rethink about what we're trying to introduce into the process here with the scenario planning and the transportation plan. I would argue it's not really necessarily an apples to apples comparison to think about it additive or to think about it in the context of the current TPO transportation model, because we're not adding to it. We're sort of rearranging. That's sort of one of the added benefits of the control total. So again, the idea would be that it's not additive traffic, it's traffic maybe more there, but necessarily becomes less somewhere else. And again, I think when we get to a point a little bit further in the analysis to understand how these different land use types, to understand how this traffic sort of rebalances, I think you will have some of that information that you're wanting. That won't come to you over these next 3 meetings. I think the importance of the October work session is to be able to convey to the board some of the public input to date, as Vlad did, and to make sure big picture that some of these concepts are headed in the right direction. And the scenario map that was included in the presentation today, the scenario map that was included in today's PowerPoint is not intended to be that future land use map. All of that will come later. All of those decisions will come later. And to the degree that public input to date has been, gosh, we should change direction in some of these areas, or not so much change direction, but continue the good things that we're already doing, increase community character, preserve some of the rural lands, do more of those things. All of that's going to come together when we get past that October 28th date. We start to have some of those detailed conversations about what do those GSAs need to become? What do those specific land use applications need to become? I don't think you've got to figure all of that out over these next 3 meetings. I think you've got to have a conversation and a determination about whether or not the concepts that are presented are representative of the public input to date, inclusive of that statistically valid citizen survey. Again, all this wasn't put together just using the MetroQuest. It's been sort of the comprehensive input to date. And so, again, I would stress to the commission, I'm not so worried about figuring out the parcel by parcel specifics, but, to the degree that you all see, if you do, any disconnect with what's been presented conceptually countywide versus some of the direction that we've received as part of the input. I think those are the important pieces that we need as staff and the consulting team for you all to tell us if there's a disconnect there.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Anybody else? All right, well, I think one other item that I wanted to address during the meeting, at least have a discussion. I sent an email out on Friday, and not everybody may have had an opportunity to look at it, but just throwing out the idea of the idea of the PC working group meetings beginning at 3 o'clock rather than 4 o'clock in the afternoon be helpful. I know that there are several members that still work for a living, and I want to be very sensitive about that. And so I just thought I'd throw it out on the table. If there is a consensus, or if the group decides they want to meet an hour earlier, we'll do a motion to amend our calendar. But other than that, I just wanted to get any thoughts on that.
Mr. Chairman, this is Jack Haldeman. I don't have a preference at all, and And I, like you, I'd like to show some deference to the people who are working, and I can meet anytime. So.
And I know Rob has a potential scheduling issue that might have an impact. And I don't know if you wanted to address that, Rob, or not.
I mean, my schedule is unfortunately very challenging at the moment with my teaching ramping up right now and some other issues. So like I said in the email, I could do 3 o'clock. It's better for me to do 4 o'clock because it's closer to the end, regular end of my day.
Yeah. Tim, I know you're on the road a lot.
Yeah. My preference would be to remain at 4. Simply, one, Mondays are always crazy days in my business. And 2, if we get back to the point where we're meeting in person, 3 becomes even that much more difficult because, at best it'll be a 30-minute commute, and at worst it's going to be an hour to an hour and a half. So, I sort of preface it in that respect that, at some point I assume we'll be going back to having in-person meetings, and, 3 o'clock would just be really tough.
Okay. Yeah, I think, go ahead.
I vote for 4 o'clock.
Yeah, we'll keep it as is scheduled on the calendar. The idea was just whether people would not want to go into the dinner hour, but we've been doing this all along, and so we'll just keep it at 4. But I at least wanted to ask the question. Okay. Anybody else wants to address anything? If not, may I have a motion to adjourn to the October 5th PC working group meeting at 4 o'clock in the afternoon?
This is Julie, so move.
Thank you. All those in favor?
Aye.
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 Opposed? All right. Thank you all for a very animated and good discussion. So thanks very much. And we'll talk to you on the 5th.